Hi, this is Ilari from On Humans, and I just returned to London from California, where I was attending a symposium on human origins held at the Salk Institute by Carter, a long-term academic collaborator with who I produced the Origins of Humankind series earlier this year. That was the most popular series in the show's history, so do check it out if you haven't yet. And if you did listen to it and enjoyed it, I have some good news, which is that I got 3 live recordings from the symposium itself with some of the leading experts in the intersection of archaeology and genetics, who will tell us 3 short chapters about the human story from the beginnings of Homo sapiens to our epic migrations across the world. So stay tuned. But in addition to those, here is a small bonus episode from the trip, a live recording featuring no world-class experts but only me, delivering a short talk on the public understanding of human evolution at UC San Diego. The title of the talk was Can We Tell a True Story of Human Origins? Enjoy.
Hi guys, I'm Meredith. I'm just going to be introducing Ilari really quickly. So I know you guys all are associated with CARTA, and as we all know, a symposium isn't just the opportunity to hear incredible minds address complex questions. CARTA is also a platform or a hub, and it acts like a magnet, right? It draws in the interesting and the interested. And Ilari Makala is definitely one such individual. He is a science communicator, a writer, and a podcaster. And it's his perspective on the human phenomenon that gathers us here tonight. He trained at Oxford in philosophy and psychology and studied Chinese philosophy at Peking University and is originally from Finland, but tonight he's joining us from his home base of London. So through his podcast On Humans, he interviews top scientists, hosting them for conversations that investigate questions of where we came from and how we got here. His list of guests include many of the iconic names in the field of human origins, such as Chris Stringer, Ian Tattersall, Sarah Blackford-Hardy, Kristen Hawkes, Richard Wrangham, and even the co-chair of our CARTA Symposium tomorrow, Johannes Kraus. He collaborated with CARTA earlier this year to produce a 5-episode podcast series called The Origins of Humankind, which gathered wide praise from scholars and media alike, including Sapiens Magazine and the ever-coveted front page of Apple Podcasts. Tonight, Ilari will be speaking on whether or not we are really able to truthfully tell the story of human origins and how narrative and story shape our shared understanding of evolution. So please join me in welcoming Ilari.
Okay, thank you, Meredith, for the very generous words, and thank you, everyone, for being here. So, can we tell a true story of human origins? That is the topic that I will talk about for the next, let's say, something between 30, 40 minutes, perhaps. And after that, I have a challenge for you, which is that you will do your best at proving me wrong and poking as many holes as you can to the story. And that way we'll all leave wiser and hopefully with our minds full of questions about the matter. So just a little bit about what the challenge is that we have a lot of debates. We have a lot of very important debates in the field, as we should. It's a scientific question, and therefore there are many scientific disagreements, and this is how science progresses. However, are there ideas, are there findings, are there questions that unify these debates to the extent that we could have the same people that one day are furiously arguing on 2 sides of the table come together signing or approving at least something that can be communicated to the broader public, to people who are interested not in the most recent debunking of a niche theory around the matter, which is very important, but which is not what many people have the cognitive space in their life to deal with, but people who want to understand if there is a story to be told. And this is the task that I will set for myself today, is to try to do this. A story which is, first of all, backed by science, backed by most recent science in a way that it's not relying on stereotypes from the 1960s. On the other hand, a story that does not need jargon to be explained. A story, I hope, that might even inspire. So that is the task. And let's see what we have. I will tell this soon as a story from the beginning to the end, but I want to actually start first in the very middle and suggest that there is a peculiar puzzle that faces us when we try to explain human origins, and this is this. Humans should not exist. Or at least so would say a cosmic alien scientist who 3 million years ago visited the Earth, did zoological predictions of what would happen to some curious apes living somewhere in the forests and the grasslands of Africa. They should absolutely not, according to this alien scientist prediction, in 3 million years, or actually much sooner, be something that we could call human. At this point, actually, it might be worth saying that I'm not only saying that we humans, as modern humans, as Homo sapiens, pick your favorite label, should not exist, but the very idea of what in the scientific literature we would call the genus Homo should not exist, based on very, very reasonable predictions that would have been made around 3 million years ago, if someone would be trying to guess. And to understand why, let's start from the very beginning. So the setting for the story. The setting is around 60 million years ago. 66 million years ago, I could say, to take us to the moment when, not far from here actually, the famous meteor impact ended the story of big land dinosaurs. Not all dinosaurs, of course, we have our wonderful bird friends still today, keeping their lineage alive. But the lands were emptied of these great beasts. But not all beasts died. There was a small squirrel-looking almost creature climbing to the tree cover, living based on the analysis of its teeth, mostly from insects and of fruits. Fruit trees were already around during the time of the dinosaurs, but there were very few, and for whatever reason, which I'm not an expert on, they started growing very much at this time. And so in this foliage of fruit trees, an insect and fruit-eating, squirrel-looking little proto-primate used to live. Now, what else can we say about this curious creature? Some would say very little because they have so many details that we do not know. But I suggest that we zoom out and say that we can actually tell a great deal because we know for sure that it's a mammal. And it is a mammal meaning it is born helpless. It is born completely incapable of surviving this world alone without parental support. And this mammalian condition, as we could call it, is something that I suggest we highlight at this point because it will become a key player as the story continues. What else can we know about this creature? Well, we don't know very much yet, but we do know that as generations and generations and generations of fruit, insect-eating, squirrel-like creatures rummage through the foliage, slowly they do evolve better and better fingers capable of grabbing branches with more and more dexterity. And we start getting something that truly merits the term primate. And so here is the setting. I suggest that we have two things. First, we have a hungry, helpless creature. We all mammals, we are not only helpless in the beginning, but of course we are very hungry because we are warm-blooded just like the birds. We need constant food. If you would have had one of these early proto-primates as a pet today, by some magic, you could not leave it home for a vacation like you can your reptile friends. This needs food all the time. Very important part of the mammalian condition and very important part of the story to be told today. What else can we say? We can say that it evolves to be a primate. It evolves all the things that we share with all the baboons and the chimpanzees and even the lemurs. First of all, they have very dexterous fingers. With time, one branch of them even evolves to wonderful opposable thumbs. Not only that, they have excellent eyesight, excellent 3D vision. It does not take great speculation to suggest that this might be because, you're jumping from branch to branch. It's a good idea to not only be able to grab the branch, but also see where the branch is. That's speculation for now, but very plausible. However, there's something very interesting. One of the most important parts of the puzzle of the story that has emerged in the last 10 years or so is that they also had a very neuron-dense brain. Neuron-dense, what does that mean? Well, normally we ask, is it a big-brained creature? It's a very reasonable question to ask, but then it's a bit like asking, is it a big computer? Well, there were very big computers in here in the 1980s. They were not necessarily very efficient. What you want is you want a lot of transistors in your computer, of course. And nowadays we can have very, very efficient computing power in very small gadgets. That's not news to anyone. But what was news to many scientists was this discovery. This came mostly from the work of Brazilian neuroscientist Susana Herculano Rosell in Vanderbilt University, who for the first time created a method of reliably counting the number of neurons. And it turns out that primate brains are excellent at being not like the computers of the 1980s, big from the outside, but thin on the inside, so to speak. They are very much like modern smartphones or something like that. They're able to pack a lot of neurons into a small space. What's more interesting, or even more important for the human story, is that it turns out that the primate brain is very, very good at scaling up. Most brains, when they grow, they become less and less and less dense, not so the primate brain. A macaque and a giraffe have the same amount of neurons in their cortex, the crust surrounding the brain. The macaque brain, as you might guess, is significantly smaller from the giraffe than the giraffe brain. So this is the setting. We have this curious creature evolving into many lineages, some with opposable thumbs, all with wonderful eyesight, and all with a brain that, if it grows very big, is able to pack a heck of a lot of neurons into it. We might answer why, and there's actually a very clear possible answer, not proven by any means, but good enough for our story today, which is that the trees are a place of safety. Now, might even say something like the Garden of Eden here, because we're talking about fruits and we're talking about a safe place far, far in the distance. Now, obviously, it does not mean that there were no dangers in the trees. But you ask any chimpanzee today, what's the safe place? Is it the ground or is it the tree? Every chimpanzee, if they would speak, they would tell you it's the tree. That's why they sleep there pretty much every single night. And what happens is that very, very well-known generalization in biology, if you have a safer environment, lower pressure from your enemies, you have the luxury of starting to take childhood more easily. More time to play, more time to wonder, more time to be a hungry, helpless infant. And this seems to have happened with these early primates living up on those trees. To put one slightly technical term here, but they slowed their life history down, as the biologist would say. This is a very well-documented condition across primate species. So what happens? Well, what happens? Something happens. Something happens because the story goes onwards. We have the drama. The drama that breaks this Garden of Eden, so to speak, is very simple. It is a dramatic climate change. If you plot the temperature, the average temperature of the globe on a graph from the time of the extinction of the dinosaurs all the way till the very recent times, archaeologically speaking, till the time that, for example, Homo sapiens is evolving, you see two things. One is that temperatures go down, 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 down. And the other one is that they become, especially when we approach the human story, they become more and more and more and more and more erratic. Every one of those spikes is an ice age. We get an increasingly cool, often dry and erratic weather, which changes the landscape of where the story now continues. The story so far has been in many places, but now the interesting part starts to happen in the landmass that is now called Africa. It used to be more connected to Europe before the Mediterranean filled up, so it's a little bit, you actually find some funky ape species, fossils even in Germany today, but we're increasingly, you can imagine the story being focused around Africa. And what happens in Africa when these climate changes happen, it's very important that this is a long trend, but it's a very, very clear progression. And what happens is that the tree cover becomes less and less. No, Africa is not one jungle and then suddenly one savanna, nor is Africa first one jungle and soon half jungle and half savanna, as some simplifications of this story have suggested. And then there has been the very reasonable pushback and the debunking of the so-called savanna hypothesis, or you might have heard about the East Side story. These were all versions of trying to tell the story of this climate change. They often got some of the details wrong, but the big picture is absolutely clear. the big picture is that Africa is losing a lot of these dense, warm rainforest environments. And this is where the drama happens. Because you remember, that's where you're safe, up in the trees. Now you get less trees. So what happens? What's the solution? Well, as I suggested earlier, the big picture is that some of these tree-living creatures, they find new homes. And they find increasingly homes in sparser woodlands and grasslands. It's a wonderful kind of quirk of chemistry that we can study this with such detail. There happens to be a different carbon isotope that you get if you're in a very open grassland environment and if you're in a dense woodland environment. The technical terms are C3 and C4. Anyone who wants to dig into them, there's plenty of material out there. But you pick any graphs showing what happens to the diet of human ancestors throughout the last, let's say, 5 million years. There's an increasing reliance on the savannas, on the sparser woodlands, on all sorts of places other than the very thick rainforest. This is where the show takes place. This is the drama, of course, because you remember why you want to be up in the trees. It's very nice and safe. And there's a lot of fruit. Now things are changing. Now there's the climax, which is that now at this point, I suggest that if you would have predictions on what's going to happen next, they would have gone to a very, very different direction. Why? Well, the first thing that seems to happen when humans start exploring more of these grasslands is the most obvious thing that sets us apart from all other mammals, which is our posture. This is a very, very particular thing about humans. And as I will try to argue, this shapes the story in remarkable, remarkable ways. It's the simple fact that we walk and we stand upright with our head pointing to the stars. It's a very, very difficult solution. Now, why? There are many benefits. Let's first of all look at the benefits. We don't know. Again, this is one of those things where you have wonderfully exciting debates going on about why exactly did bipedalism evolve. I don't know. I don't even pretend to know. However, it does not prevent us from telling this story, which is that for various reasons, bipedalism paid off when you move away from that thick tree forest. One is that for long walking and later running, it's more energy efficient. That has been well studied. That's one suggestion. You can carry foods. If you look at when do chimpanzees walk, you give them a lot of bananas. They will grab the bananas and walk on 2 feet. They're very clumsy, but they will do it. So if you're moving across a vast territory, gathering food, which is in an environment that is not so dense with, for example, those fruits or leaves, it might be a good idea to be able to carry them. Perhaps, I'm not saying that this is the reason. There are other bonuses, other theories that have suggested. One is you see far. You can see the predators coming. You can see the prey from far away. You get less sun exposure. This might explain why we only have hair here, is that we're trying to minimize the sun exposure by standing upright. And there are other theories, but I'm not here to suggest that one of them is the right theory, but it's not. The mystery is what's the right explanation and how much these different explanations contribute to the story. But it is clear that the story is there, it seems. We, unlike anyone else, learned to, or evolved, I should say, to have our bodies constantly in an upright position, walking. And this is a very, very, very big issue, this point about walking. Not climbing in the trees, but walking. Why? Well, if you look at the chimpanzee foot, it looks like a hand. It's a grabbing instrument. The more our ancestors spent time on the ground, the more they evolved a foot that is a weight-bearing instrument. It's a walking instrument. You lose the capacity to climb very well, but you do become more efficient walker. But this is a very big problem for the babies. What do chimpanzee babies do? They grab to their mom, and they grab with their fingers and their toes. And the mom, by the way, has fur. So the bipedalism was everything but easy, especially for the children. And remember, the mammalian and the primate condition, increasingly helpless, children with longer and longer childhoods. But now we get very difficult childhoods. There's another problem with childhoods. This is the fact that our hips are remodeled for walking upright. Our pelvises become narrow, or the birth canal becomes narrower. It becomes more and more difficult to birth babies. This is the famous obstetric dilemma. Again, if you have followed the science news around this, you will have seen very interesting articles saying the obstetric dilemma has been debunked. Look carefully, it has not been debunked. What has been challenged is the explanation for why the pelvis cannot be much bigger in bipeds. The original explanation is that it makes you a bad walker when you have to rotate your hips like this. That doesn't seem to be the reason. But there are other very good reasons related to bipedalism. One is that if you have too wide of a hip and you're standing upright, well, you don't have pelvic floor support for your intestines and for the embryo, the fetus. So anyway, there's a lot of interesting questions about how the details of this dilemma work out. But it's obvious from the biology that this is a big problem for upright hominins and later humans. There's a further problem, which is that we're not the only creature that walks on two legs. Kangaroos, they hop. T-Rex, it moved on two legs. But what's special about us is that we move upright. If you look at all the other bipedal creatures, they have a heavy tail. Now, what's the one thing that makes apes and monkeys different? Apes don't have a tail. You can have fun by, if you take your child to a toy shop and you buy them the gorilla toy very often has a silly little tail. You can teach them biology. It should not take the tail away. Gorillas don't have tails. We don't have tails because we are apes. And this becomes a very big issue if you want to be bipedal, because you cannot anymore do the T-Rex style thing, which is significantly easier for the body mechanics, where you're leaning up front and your legs are kind of in the middle of the weight. You have to have a very straight back and you have to have the funny S in your spine. And what does this do? This makes our whole system very, very prone to injuries. Everything from minor back pain to significantly more serious injuries. And what's even worse is that when you do injure your foot, how many do you have left? You have 1 foot left. You injure your knee, how many healthy knees do you have left? 1. You ask the same question from your dog, they have 3. You become more prone to injuries, and the injuries become significantly more dangerous. So we're in a very, very funny position, where we have a lot of pains of posture, as I might call it. We have the narrower birth canal. Our feet become weight-bearing instruments, so the babies are not able to cling to their caregivers in the same way. We get increased injuries and increased risk of injuries. And however, very interestingly, there's a fantastic, unfortunately, this fossil has not received a proper name, KNMR2596. Well, that's a name to have. This is a fossil from Kenya from 1.9 million years ago. We're not exactly sure which Latin name should be plugged onto this, but it is a human in the sense that it is part of the genus Homo. It had a big ankle accident in its life and it healed. There's no way this creature living out in the open would have healed without there being support. So this is a little hint of what's to come. But when you just look at these problems of posture, we get a very big puzzle. We leave the trees into more dangerous habitats. We get this walking posture. Injuries become more common and more tricky. We get the walking toes. The babies cannot cling to their mothers, and we have narrower hips, making it more difficult to give birth. What happens next? You ask this from the alien scientist, and the answer is you're going to have creatures that have to speed up their life history. They have to have shorter childhoods to produce more rabbit-like offspring. They cannot invest so much in brain power, but they probably will evolve some kind of, big teeth or claws, whatever makes them really dangerous for predators, maybe a bit like a gorilla. Well, we get all the opposites. And this is the puzzle. This was very nicely explained to me by Tim Colson, who used to be the head of the biology department at Oxford. He said that instead of speeding up our life history, evolution starts to explore larger brain sizes. Instead of becoming the tougher one who is able to fight the predators, you become the smarter one. But hold on a second. How are you able to do that? Well, in some sense, it's easy because we are primates. And as I said, primates are such that if you're a big primate and you're able to fuel a big primate-like brain, you're going to have a very, very smart brain, a very neuron-dense brain. But it's much easier said than done because we just ignored half of the puzzle. What about the risks of childhood? How can you don't just decide to grow a brain, you have to be able it takes time. So how are you able to do it? And there's many mysteries in here, and I suggest that when we understand these mysteries, we do not only explain human origins, but we to some extent, in at least a very high level, explain very key aspects of the human condition. So the big question is, how to grow a human brain? You have to do three things. So the first two things is you have to survive yourself, and you have to make sure that the kids survive. But remember that the habitat is increasingly dangerous and that kids are increasingly helpless. And as your toes are remodeled by evolution, you cannot do what the baboons do. You know, the baboons live on this dangerous habitat, but they can climb up the tree when there's danger. You become increasingly ill-adapted of having this escape route as a human. And number three, a brain is very expensive. If you follow this literature, you would have heard very many times that the brain takes 20% of all of our body energy. It's 2% of the body weight, it takes 20% of the body energy. Maybe those numbers are a bit off, but you get the picture. This is a very, very serious challenge. How to do it? Well, let's begin with number one and number two. I think we actually have the answers. How to survive the increasingly dangerous habitat and take care of the increasingly helpless kids? Well, the solution is very simple. You have to stick together. For survival, the playbook is very clear across primates. You use alarm calls, you use vigilance, but now you have to do it at night. You have to have roles. You stay up, I go sleep. Let's turn into 2 hours or whatever. You have to take care of the sick. Remember that fossil with a very complicated name. Someone was looking after that fossil, and probably not just one person. What about childcare? Well, again, there's a lot of debate here on how exactly we solved the childcare problem. How can humans have this very long childhood despite all of the problems mentioned earlier? A very important answer comes from the work of Sarah Bluffer Hardy, especially, which is alloparenting, the idea that humans are very, very different from chimpanzees. Chimpanzee mother does not let others touch the baby typically. The chimpanzee moms they're super moms. You know, they take care of it all by themselves. But humans are not like that. We depend on help. In Hardy's story, it's typically the community as a whole. Sometimes the big sisters especially seem to play also a big role. There are others like Kristen Hawkes who focuses on grandmothers. Some focus on dads. You get pair bonding. I don't know which of these is the right answer, but certainly some of these together are the answer that explains why humans cannot raise our children alone. We simply cannot. And so the lesson is indeed that it does take a village, no man is an island, or whatever slogan you want to put on this. So this part of the story seems pretty clear. What about the third bit? What about feeding the very hungry brain? Again here, there's a lot of debate about the details, but we do know the big picture. We have a story to tell, or so I believe. It's a very interesting problem, though, before I suggest the answer, because not only do we get these increasingly, these big thirsty brains, but we also shrink our teeth, and we shrink our guts. You look at chimpanzee bellies, they look a little bit like they would have eaten maybe a bit too much. They haven't eaten too much. They have very, very big guts. There's a whole hypothesis about how the human brain increase was possible because we shrink our gut. And the gut is also very expensive tissue. But that kind of kicks the can down the road. Yeah, but how are you able now with a smaller gut to digest all of the calories needed? So what's the answer? Well, famously, Richard Wrangham suggested that the answer must be fire. The problem is we don't really have very good evidence of fire going very far back. But it's a very, very important suggestion because it points out that cooking and in general food processing must be the key. So we have a lot of possibilities here. One is that before fire, you simply use stone tools. What would be more human, archaeologically speaking, than having a stone tool and cutting meat, pounding meat, grinding nuts? You pre-process the food, so you're able to get more calories out of it with less teeth power and less gut energy, and you're able to feed the brain. Maybe use the stone tools to access more fatty parts of the carcass. You eat the bone marrow. There's a great anecdote Chris Stringer told me about in Boxgrove in England. We have Homo heidelbergensis, so something 500,000 years ago, something like that. We have these archaic humans living in Britain during a time when one of those climate spikes was in the very warm period. You had hippos and rhinos swimming in the River Thames. And one of these poor rhinos was butchered by Homo heidelbergensis group, and the brain was eaten. It's a very nice way to feed your own brain. You eat the fatty brain, and you use stone tools to access it. Some people believe that seafood is a big part of it. We don't really have very good evidence for this, but the problem is if you have a fishing net, well, that's not going to stay in the archaeological record, so I'm going to leave this as a very, very nice possibility. Anyone who goes to a sushi restaurant will have noticed that you don't need that much fire to cook the fish into a very nice edible shape. And by the way, the fish will give you a lot of omega-3s, which, as any biohacker will tell you, are an excellent idea if you're trying to grow a brain. Fermentation, that's a really recent, exciting idea. Accidental fermentation, you bring food to the camp, you let it sit there for a while, it accidentally ferments, and ta-da, what normally happens in the long chimpanzee colon now has happened externally, you don't need the long colon anymore. Very possibly part of the story. But whatever, we haven't figured the story out properly in the details, but we do know the big picture. Is that in order to grow the human brain, you have to secure the long childhoods. We do that by doing it together. And you have to feed it, and we do that by having food technology, cooking, and interesting ways of sourcing our food. And this leads into a very, very interesting lesson. We depend on technology, and technology is not in our genes. For humans, tools and teachers are a biological necessity. No one comes out of the womb and starts making an Acheulean handbags. No one comes out of the tomb and knows exactly, oh, this is how I'm going to access, the juiciest bit of the bone marrow. Even these very early steps, someone will have taught. And the more we rely on things like fire-based cooking, and the more we rely on complicated tools, it becomes a biological necessity for humans to have teachers around. And having those long childhoods now becomes a very, very nice thing indeed. So, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I would suggest that if you do ask for the oldest professions, and there's the whole joke that prostitution must be it, well, maybe, I don't know. Of course, hunting, foraging, fishing, that's obviously the oldest profession. But what are the oldest roles that have to be filled in the human story? Would be nurses and doctors. Of course, probably not specialized healers in the beginning. A friend will do the job, but someone who will look after you when you have that broken ankle. Midwives, nannies, anyone who can help with the child that simply is too much for an individual mother in the human condition to take care of. And very importantly, cooks, artisans, and teachers. Without the roles that nowadays are fulfilled by these professions, the bet of the alien scientists would have turned out right. They would not have been big-brained, relatively weak, bipedal, long childhood creatures running around. We would not be here, and yet we are. But this leaves a little bit of a mystery. I remember I think Pascal himself once said to me that you should not be allowed to talk about human origins without mentioning language. And so I have to mention language. And here is where it gets very tricky. Language very much does not fossilize. So this is a very tricky point. I do want to say a couple of things about it, though. I want to say two red herrings that I don't think we should pursue. One is that all animals have semiotics, all animals have something like language. Yeah, probably. I mean, sure. I am in absolutely no way saying that there is not a definition of language by which non-human animals can have it. I think actually that will probably help us a great deal to study those things in as much detail as we can. However, there has not been a single suggestion, if you look carefully at the literature, not a single suggestion of an open-ended communication system, a communication system that can produce an infinite amount of expressions, not many expressions, not here is an expression, here's another expression, you put them together, you get a third one, and now we have 4 expressions that these creatures use. No, infinite amount, talking about things that are not happening right here. Still, the textbook example of an animal talking about something that is not right here is the bee dance. And that's a wonderful example, but as you can see, it's not an infinite amount of possibilities, it's explaining where is the target flower. So I don't believe that we should stop focusing on language as a key part of the human story. On the other hand, I don't think that we should follow the idea of Noam Chomsky and others who focus on a sudden flip. There's something that happens, genetic mutation, and wow, you wake up into a syntactic reality. What is the syntactic reality? It's a reality where you're able to say sentences like, the woman who she saw yesterday gave me the fish that I had already wanted to buy. Okay, that's a very complicated sentence. Good luck speaking like that your whole day. Most of us don't actually use recursive syntax that much. Recursive syntax, this kind of Chomskyan syntax, is very interesting, and it has played a very important role in cognitive science in the 50s and 60s. However, we could very well speak without any recursive syntax if we want to be a bit poetic. I can tell you a story. The sun shines, the fire crackles, the people speak. The people don't use Chomskyan syntax. That's a perfectly valid human expression. I mean, it's just as good as any other. So if you're a linguist and you want to study syntax, go ahead and study syntax. However, it's probably not the be-all, end-all of human language. So these are 2 red herrings that I think that we should avoid. What's in between? Well, there's a couple of very interesting points if we think back at the story that has been told. Where do other primates vocalize the most? Alarm calls. Probably rings a bell in terms of the difficulties faced in this the dangerous land environment leaving the trees. Why can human body produce sounds with such subtlety? There's actually a very interesting way in which this relates to bipedalism, of being upright. If you look at the way that walking on 4 legs, it synchronizes rhythm in a certain way to the way that you're walking, and it puts a lot of pressure on the lungs, and being on all 4s makes it much more difficult to do subtle articulation. Definitely not the reason humans speak, but it's an interesting part of the puzzle. Another one, when do humans learn language? At childhood. Could it be that these helpless children that can no more cling to their mothers and are wanting and have their needs that they want to have fulfilled by someone in the community, could it be that their vocalizations are the root of language? I think it very well could be. However, very unfortunately, I do not think that we have yet a true story about the origins of language. This is where I have to disappoint. But I do suggest beyond this one possible way to flip this question, and then some pushbacks. Remember that the scaling effects of the primate brain mean that if you have a very big primate that's able to fuel a brain the size that it kind of should have, the same 2% of its body than a small monkey has, you get a massive amount of neurons. Indeed, the human cortex has 16 billion neurons, more than any other creature in the world. The next is chimpanzee with 6 billion. So you see that there's a big gap if you just look at how many neurons you have in the cortex of humans compared to other creatures. So there is a way in which you could flip the angle and say, what is a creature with 16 billion cortical neurons supposed to do? Shut up? Stop vocalizing? Keep vocalizing in the exactly same limited way as the creatures before it? Now, this would be a possible answer. There is no mystery. I mean, that's just kind of what you do if you get this kind of a brain as we do, and we have already talked about why we have this kind of a brain. However, perhaps not so. There are reasons to think that maybe this is something that is very much Homo sapiens related. Without going too much into the details, there's some possibilities of why language might be very, very uniquely Homo sapiens, not just late genus Homo, big brain genus Homo. Remember, Neanderthals, they have those same 16 billion cortical neurons. One is that we are a very uniquely cultural creature. It's not just those famous cave paintings. You look at color red in the archaeological record and you see an explosion of it around the sites of Homo sapiens around a bit over 100,000 years ago. Another one is that around 2% of Neanderthal DNA survives in many modern humans, but not in genes relevant to brain development. This is not an absolute rule, but generally speaking, you seem to have a lot of selection against Neanderthal brain development. Or maybe there is something special about our brain. And indeed, if you look at the skulls, if you look at the Sapiens and Neanderthal skulls, there are some very remarkable differences. One is the ball-like shape of the Homo sapiens skull. Now, there's some speculation that maybe this means this is related to language. If you look at the areas that we have more than the Neanderthals, one is the so-called parietal cortex, one is the cerebellum. And if you want to use as evidence, you can absolutely argue that these are places related to coordination, associative thinking. This is very speculative, but there's definitely a story there that could be told. Maybe this becomes the story in 10 years' time. As I said, I will disappoint on the language front. I don't think we do have a true story. And indeed, I think that the summary of the talk today is that, yes, I do believe that we can tell a probably true story about the origins of humankind, as in the genus Homo, all the way into the kind of big-brained humans starting to pop up. But did, for example, Homo erectus tell stories? Was Homo erectus interested in telling the story of its own origins? That I don't think we have an answer to yet. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that was it for today. Thanks for sticking with me until the very end. Now, unfortunately, the recording equipment that we had did not really allow us to get good quality audio from the very long Q&A that followed, so the episode will end here. But stay tuned for upcoming 3 live episodes from San Diego, covering how the science of genetics is shedding light on the epic story of modern humans. So stay tuned and subscribe. Until next time, take care.